Thank you for watching iTablet. Be sure to like this video, subscribe, and comment #iTablet to enter the iPad mini giveaway when the channel reaches 2,000 subscribers. Welcome back to the channel. In this video I want to talk about iPadOS 18 and what's coming for the iPad Pro in 2024. So the rumors indicate that it looks as though we are getting new M3 iPads next year, so that would be the iPad Air and the iPad Pro. The rumors also indicate that we are getting a larger iPad Air, which would be the same size as the largest iPad Pro, which is 12.9 inches. And it looks as though we are getting a much larger iPad Pro, which is going to be about 13 or 14 inches across. Those are significant updates because if we have larger iPad Airs, it means that people who are not that interested in having the best hardware or even the best performance out of the best iPad Pros will have the option to go for the iPad Air, which would be great for things like watching movies and obviously drawing and all kinds of things. Adding another size to the iPad Air would make a lot of sense because that would complete Apple's price ladder. So let's just ignore the iPad mini for the moment because that's a different product at a different price point, but Apple can then say that the iPad is really cheap because it starts at a price of £369. But when people come to the store and they start playing with this one, they see the nicer iPad right next to it, which is the 10th generation iPad, at just a little bit more, at £499. Then they see that this one has a keyboard, you can use a pencil and all those things, and then they think, well, you know, I'm so close in price when I add the keyboard and the Apple Pencil that I may as well jump up to the iPad Air. And as soon as they start adding the Apple Pencil and the keyboard to the iPad Air, they're really close in price to the iPad Pro. And also, this may be a little bit too expensive for them, seeing as though on top of the £900 over here, you still need to add the Magic Keyboard and the Apple Pencil, which means that this may be the psychological barrier for when people buy iPads, which means that they may consider looking at the iPad Pro because it has a large screen, but they don't want to spend over £1,000 for this, which means that they'll stick to the iPad Air and basically buy the most expensive iPad Air, which would be the largest of the two. So it makes a lot of sense for the average consumer because they have all these options in the middle here, which then ultimately ends with the purchase of a very large iPad Air. For the Pro customer, on the other hand, the Pro customer ignores all of these because they don't want smaller screens, they don't want hardware that's not as good, they want the best screen they could possibly get, which means that they go straight for the iPad Pro. And in order for Apple to reinvigorate sales next year, they really need to do something great with the iPad Pro and also with iPadOS. And that means that making the largest iPad much larger, redesigning the Magic Keyboard, maybe doing something new with the Apple Pencil. Apple doesn't want to create just one product for you to buy, which means that redesigning the iPad next year with a better screen and all those things still is backwards compatible with this Magic Keyboard. They want to create three different products that they can sell you, which means a new Apple Pencil with magnetic tips, which means that you can easily swap out the tips. Obviously an iPad which is larger, which doesn't fit the current Magic Keyboard, which then forces you to upgrade the entire system. That's very smart from Apple's point of view. I think it's going to be a very expensive year next year for the Pro customer because the rumors indicate that the next year's OLED iPads will be incredibly expensive. And that brings me to iPadOS. So the iPad has been creeping up in price over the years, which means that it's now as expensive to buy an iPad as it is to buy a MacBook Air in most cases. That's definitely true for the iPad Pro. As bad as that sounds, that's actually a really good thing for the Pro customer because that means that if Apple's going to create a much more expensive iPad Pro, they may be entering a world where they don't want you to buy the iPad plus a MacBook or the iPad plus a Mac Mini. They might be in a place now where they can accept the fact that most people just want to live in iPadOS and just want to buy a MacBook because Apple will get as much money as they possibly can from the iPad Pro customer, which means that if next year's iPad Pro starts at something like £1,800, which is the same price as an entry-level MacBook Pro, that means that they can get the most money out of that customer, which means that they don't need to sell that customer a MacBook as well. And if Apple's planning on creating an iPad as expensive as a MacBook, that forces them to upgrade iPadOS to something which would be as good as macOS in order for it to make sense for the Pro customer to switch to iPadOS and not miss macOS. So I expect big changes for iPadOS next year. And these changes come at exactly the right time because the M3 will be coming to the iPad Air plus the iPad Pro. So what does Apple need to do in iPadOS 18 to make it worthwhile for somebody to buy just an iPad instead of an iPad plus a MacBook? Well, first of all, Apple needs to solve multitasking. I would love for Apple to fix Stage Manager and make it a lot more powerful, or basically delete Stage Manager and start all over. The reason for that is that from the keyboards, it's very hard to control where windows go. Plus also, Stage Manager is very hands-on, which means that if you're using this with an external monitor or you're using this just like on the iPad, you still need to reach up and touch the screen quite a lot. Because, yet again, there are no keyboard shortcuts in order to put one window on the one side and one window on the other side, or split them into 4, or I don't know how many, or any way that I want to control the screen. So I really want Apple to rethink how this works and also introduce keyboard shortcuts so that it would be a lot easier to control this situation. Because the thing I really hate about Stage Manager at this point is the fact that you don't really know what it's going to do. Like when I drag other apps onto the stage, I don't know if it's going to split screen or, yeah, exactly. So I didn't even know where this was going to go because Stage Manager just decides on the fly where it wants to put things. When I think about what I want to do with the screen, I want to use as much of the screen as possible and put my apps exactly where I want them. But again, there are no keyboard shortcuts at the moment for me to be able to control where these windows go. So that's something I desperately want next year. The next thing I want Apple to fix is the Files app. This is a good app, but it's not as good as it could be. It feels as though Apple has been jumping through hoops to create something which is not the Finder. And in my opinion, the Finder is one of the best ways to control a computer and to find the files that you want to use and to be able to move things from one app to another app. And I know Apple's philosophy with the iPad is that you should not be using files on the iPad, but unfortunately, this thing is turning into a computer whether they like it or not. The iPad customer wants to be able to use the iPad in the same way that they use a MacBook. So if you're going to give us keyboard and mouse support, you need to give us a better Finder. The next thing I want Apple to do in iPadOS 18 is squash all the bugs. If you live in iPadOS and if you use the iPad as much as I do, you will know about all the annoying little bugs that have crept in over the years. The most annoying thing at the moment is that sometimes the Magic Keyboard is not recognized by the iPad, or sometimes when you hit space to unlock the iPad, nothing happens. So there are so many places in the system where things are just broken, and it's not a hardware thing, because obviously I've taken my iPad and Magic Keyboard to Apple. They've looked at it and they couldn't find a problem. One of the most annoying things is when you use Safari to buy something on Apple and you tap into the text fields. That does not even really always work on the iPad. So there are many, many places where either a website doesn't work or something just doesn't work the way that Apple says it's going to work. So unfortunately, Apple's slogan for the longest time has been, it just works. When it comes to the iPad, it just doesn't. Like, there's just too many bugs all over the place, and Apple just needs to do a big cleanup for iPadOS 18. The iPad has had keyboard and mouse support for quite a few years now, and even after all this time, it still feels like it's an afterthought, because touch still remains the primary input method for the iPad. Unfortunately, like I said earlier, there are quite a few users who want to use the iPad as a MacBook replacement. And at the moment, they need to do a lot of refinements to how the keyboard and mouse is integrated into the system. Yes, it's really good at the moment, but one thing that they desperately need to change is give us the option to change the dot to something else, like a cursor or something like that. Because when you are working in Figma or you're working in Pro apps, you want to be able to precisely select what you're doing. And of course, if you want to do precise selection, you can use the Apple Pencil. But how do you use the Apple Pencil when you're using it with an external monitor? Users want this thing to be a MacBook replacement. They want to be able to connect an external monitor. They want to be able to do whatever they can with the MacBook on the iPad. And at the moment, the iPad is just fighting you too many times, because cursor, the mouse support, is still trying to simulate how you would do something with the finger with touch instead of make it work the way it would work on a MacBook. Next up, I would love for Apple to create a clamshell mode for the iPad Pro or the iPad. What that means is that when you use it with the Studio Display, you can close the iPad and just connect the cable and use it like a MacBook in clamshell mode. So that means not touching the display, not touching the Magic Keyboard or anything like that, but using the external mouse and keyboard to control the iPad. Next, we need a real browser on the iPad. At the moment, we have obviously most of the browsers that you get on the desktop you can bring over onto iPad, but this is basically the baby internet or the baby version of a real browser. So what I mean by that is that with something like Safari, you can add extensions, but when you open up something like Chrome, you can't, because everything on the iPad is so tightly controlled that's basically Opera, Chrome, all the other web browsers are just a reskinned version of Safari. And unfortunately, in this day and age, especially for a device which is basically as good as a MacBook in terms of internals, we should not have this limitation, because this is basically Apple just saying, look, they don't want us to create web apps or links on our desktop to web apps. They want us to buy the apps through the App Store. I can understand why Apple doesn't want to include a real web browser, but if they're selling something called an iPad Pro, they need to be able to let pros or people who want the best out of their devices do the most with that device. Next up, we need more Pro apps on the iPad Pro. And yes, I know that at the moment we have Final Cut, which works really well. You can see that I edited my last video in Final Cut on the iPad Pro, but where are the rest of the real Pro apps? Where is real Photoshop, real Figma? All of those apps have basically been pared down to create iPad versions of those apps. And just like I just said about the browser, for something that costs the same as a MacBook, running the same chip as the MacBook, we need to be able to run the exact same version of the Pro app on the iPad. Next, Apple should bring AI to the entire lineup, which means macOS, iPadOS, and iOS. At the moment, they are slightly behind with other companies such as OpenAI with ChatGPT, because Apple takes much longer to add new features to their products just because they're a lot more careful about how they implement these things. Obviously, Apple doesn't call anything in their lineup AI, they call it machine learning. And I think the reason why they do this is because they know that people are quite scared of AI. They think that AI is going to take their jobs, and they think that AI is the scary new thing that they don't really understand yet. So Apple needs to find a way for the rest of the markets to educate their customers on exactly the promise and the capabilities of AI, and then they will bring that to things like the iPad and the iPhone. The next feature I think we need on iPadOS is multi-user support. Obviously you can do this with the shared iPads feature in the Classroom app, but you can't do this on iPadOS yet. So I think that every year we ask for this feature, and every year we are excited that this might be added to the iPad. I think that this is never going to happen. The reason for that is that it all comes down to money. Apple doesn't want you to buy one iPad for your kids. So if you have 3 kids, they don't want you to install all 3 kids onto the same iPad, because obviously that's way too easy. That means that they only sell one iPad. They want you to buy 3 different iPads because the iPad is meant as a personal device. It's not meant as a device that you share, like a MacBook or a Mac Mini. Next up, this could be a really exciting change if it's true. It looks as though Apple might add third-party app stores to the iPhone, which I think would then also come to the iPad. This would be really great because it means that we can bypass all the restrictions that Apple puts onto the software that goes on the iPad, and we can quite possibly get real Pro apps from third-party app stores that have not been dumbed down or redesigned for iPad. Obviously, Apple wants to very tightly control the experience on the iPad, and they want to make sure that any app that is running on the iPad is optimized for touch first. I think that if we have third-party app stores, that would mean that developers can bypass all those restrictions and they can give us proper apps, which means we'll most likely be able to get real Chrome on the iPad with real extensions and use an app which is very similar to the Mac version. Obviously, this opens up a massive privacy and security loophole, and it's probably going to be a bit of a nightmare, and people will get hacked because of apps that are not as secure as the ones in the App Store at the moment. But this is one of those risks which they will most likely educate users about before they install the third-party App Store. If Apple is introducing an OLED iPad, it would make sense for them to introduce something like standby mode on the iPad as well, because obviously then the screen can stay always on. This is great on the iPhone at the moment because you can use it as an alarm clock by the side of your bed, or you can display photos and things like that while you are not using the phone. And I think on the iPad with a giant screen like this, it would be even more useful. So I would suspect that Apple's going to make a big deal out of a redesigned lock screen next year when they can finally show off the larger standby mode on the iPad. Next, for some reason, a lot of YouTubers, they want to bring the Watch app to the iPad. I think this is a bit of a silly request, and I don't really see why this would be useful, because at the moment this works perfectly on the iPhone, and it kind of makes sense that the Watch and the iPhone are tied together because those are the two devices that are on your body basically the entire day. If we get the Watch app on the iPad, it's interesting. Like, is this something that is cool? Do we want this? I mean, would it make sense for this app just to be larger on this giant screen? I don't really see what makes this so compelling. But for some reason, YouTubers, they keep shouting about this and they really want this. So if they introduce it, happy day, but this is not something I see myself using at all. Next up, users keep shouting about the fact that there is no calculator app on the iPad at the moment. Obviously one that's made by Apple. I could not care less about this. The fact that Apple has not made a calculator app in 2023 on the iPad, that is not something that's very interesting to me. I feel as though there are so many other things that Apple needs to fix across the entire system with the hardware, with all these things to make it as good as a MacBook. And the fact that YouTubers are jumping up and down about a calculator app, it just feels misguided, and it feels like shouting about the wrong thing, because Apple has so many other things to do before they worry about making a calculator app. And then I feel as though we get to the most obvious change in iPadOS 18, which would be, what if they made iPadOS 18 really great and they installed it on all the iPads, but they also gave pro users the ability to run macOS on the iPad. I think 2024 will be a big year for iPadOS, because it's rumored that Apple is going to make iPadOS a lot more similar to macOS, because they want the iPad Pro to be a creator class device, which means that you could film on this, you can edit on this, you can export from this, you can do everything on the iPad. Yes, you can do that today, but obviously it's quite painful, it's very slow, it's a bit cumbersome to use, and it's not as fast as using a MacBook, because on the MacBook with macOS, you can just really attack your files and you can use a mouse and keyboard and you can just go to town and work really quickly. On the iPad, it's still very slow because of multitasking and all those things that hold you back, and it's much harder to use than on the MacBook. So I would love to see a world where Apple gives us the opportunity to install macOS on the iPad. And yes, you can type as many times as you want in the comments on this video how stupid that idea is and how you don't want that. But there are users who do want that, and I am one of them. I want to have one device. I want to have one device which runs the best operating system, which in my opinion is macOS, and I want to be able to draw on that OS with the Apple Pencil, and I want to be able to touch the screen and use it like an iPad. Because I feel as though macOS and iPadOS are becoming so similar. I mean, this already looks like 1 or 2 steps away from what the iPad will look like in about 2 years. I mean, it's so similar, and I know they make it look similar so that the user of the iPad feels comfortable switching to macOS and vice versa, but we're getting to a place now where things are getting so similar that they may as well give us the opportunity to choose one or the other. I don't expect that to ever happen, and you can please comment on this video and tell me just how stupid I am for wanting that, but it would really change my life if I could just travel with one device, go to work with one device, and do everything on one device instead of like relying on a Mac for work and an iPad for the rest of my computing needs. Thank you for watching iTablet. Be sure to like this video, subscribe, and comment #iTablet to enter the iPad mini giveaway when the channel reaches 2,000 subscribers.